Zaria's silver tray was an extension of her own arm. Balance, glide, step. She counted the guests by the color of their shoes because looking them in the eye was a luxury she couldn't afford. 42 tuxedos to the velvet rope. 12 silk gowns to the champagne refill station. 6 paces to the left, and she should hit the service corridor where the noise of the gala faded into the sterile quiet of the kitchen. The kitchen manager, Mr. Henderson, had promised her a break 20 minutes ago. Henderson wasn't there 20 minutes ago. Henderson wasn't there now. He had ducked out for a cigarette, leaving Zaria to navigate a sea of Scottsdale's elite alone, carrying a tray of red wine through a ballroom she was never meant to inhabit. Zaria adjusted her grip on the silver rim and shifted her weight. She was off. She didn't know she was off, but the shifting crowd had pushed her 4 feet to the north. The service door she needed was behind her, not in front of her. She was walking directly into the center of the VIP atrium, where the golden chandeliers hung lower, the marble was slicker, and nobody paid attention to a waitress in a fitted black vest, because this was the kind of place where the help was as invisible as the air. She collided with something solid. Not a serving cart, not a marble pillar, a man. The impact was sudden, sending the silver tray tilting violently toward her chest. The crystal flutes didn't just fall, they shattered against the person in front of her. Red wine, deep, dark, and expensive, erupted forward. She heard the liquid hit the fabric. Expensive fabric, the kind that absorbed the vintage Cabernet with a heavy, muted thrum instead of a splash. 4 people nearby gasped, actually gasped. Zaria heard them with terrifying clarity. A woman in pearls to her right sucked in air so hard her necklace rattled. A massive man standing just behind the stranger muttered a low command in Korean. A third guest farther away whispered, "Do you know who that is?" The silence that followed was suffocating. It was the kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, but stops the heart. The kind of silence that happens when the most dangerous man in the city is covered in a stain that looks exactly like blood. Welcome back to Afro Underworld Empire. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe, like, and share. Tell us in the comments section, what would you do if you saw your lost loved one's face in a complete stranger? The heavy, metallic scent of the vintage Cabernet rose from Seo-Jin's chest, but he didn't blink. He didn't even look down at the dark, jagged stain spreading across his hand-stitched silk shirt like a fresh wound. His entire world had narrowed to the woman standing inches from him. Zaria felt the air leave her lungs. Her silver tray was still clutched in her hands, vibrating with the force of her racing heart. She looked up, prepared to stammer an apology, to beg for her job, to face the wrath of a man who clearly held the power of life and death in this room. But the words died in her throat. The man before her wasn't angry. He was haunted. His dark, piercing eyes were wide, tracking every line of her heart-shaped face with a terrifying, desperate intensity. He looked at her as if she were a miracle, or a curse. I am so sorry, sir," Zaria finally whispered, her voice trembling. She reached instinctively toward her apron for a cloth, her fingers brushing the air between them. "Please, let me." Before she could move, a shadow loomed behind Seo-Jin. Sung-Ho Park stepped forward, his face a mask of cold efficiency. His hand reached into his blazer, and his eyes scanned Zaria with the lethal precision of a predator identifying a threat. "Move back," Sung-Ho commanded, his voice a low growl. He reached out to shove Zaria aside, intent on clearing the mess away from his boss. "Don't touch her." The command was quiet, but it sliced through the gasps of the crowd like a blade. Seo-Jin didn't turn his head. He didn't take his eyes off Zaria. He raised a single hand, stopping Sung-Ho in his tracks. The bodyguard hesitated, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Sir, the wine—" "Your shirt is ruined. We need to." "I said, stay back," Seo-Jin repeated. His voice was thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in years, a raw, aching recognition that defied logic. To him, the golden chandeliers of the gala had faded into the background. The music was gone. In the middle of this cold, opulent atrium, he was looking at the woman he had buried months ago. The same soft cheekbones, the same expressive, dark brown eyes that always showed exactly what she was feeling. Zaria stood frozen, her breath hitching as Seo-Jin stepped closer, closing the gap until she could smell the expensive sandalwood of his cologne beneath the sharp tang of the wine. He reached out, his long fingers hovering just inches from her cheek, trembling almost imperceptibly. "Is it really you?" he murmured, the words so low they were meant only for her. Zaria's defensive independence flared for a second, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. "Sir, I'm Zaria. I just work here." The sound of her name, different, yet spoken in that same melodic tone, seemed to snap a chord inside him. Seo-Jin's hand dropped, but his gaze remained locked on hers, possessive and unwavering. He didn't care about the ruined tuxedo or the whispering elite. He had spent months in the dark, and suddenly he was standing in the light. He wasn't going to let it go out again. The restaurant where Zaria worked was a far cry from the gilded Gala. It was a place of scuffed linoleum, the smell of burnt espresso, and the constant, rhythmic clatter of silverware. Yet, every afternoon at exactly 3:00 p.m., the atmosphere shifted. The door would chime, and Seo-Jin Kang would walk in, his presence acting like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. He didn't belong here, yet he sat in the same back booth every day, a silent sentinel in a world of peeling wallpaper. Zaria felt his eyes on her from the moment she clocked in. It wasn't the lecherous gaze she was used to from some of the regulars. It was something heavier, a weight that followed her as she balanced trays and refilled water glasses. He never ordered food. He only ever requested the cheapest red wine on the menu, a vintage that likely tasted like vinegar to a man of his status, and he never touched it. He simply sat, his long fingers wrapped around the glass, watching her. "He's back," Lena whispered, leaning over the counter as she polished a glass. "The handsome Grim Reaper. Zaria, seriously, who is he? He hasn't looked at the menu once in 4 days." "I don't know," Zaria muttered, tucking a loose curl back into her bun. "And I don't care. As long as he pays his tab, he's just another customer." But she was lying. Her heart hammered against her ribs every time she had to approach his table. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, or worse. A miracle he was waiting to see again. When she finally gathered the courage to take his check, her hand brushed against the table. Seo-Jin didn't look at the bill. He looked at her wrist, at the way her pulse jumped beneath her skin. "You're late today," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to bypass her ears and go straight to her spine. "I don't keep a schedule for customers, sir," Zaria replied, her defensive independence sharpening her tone. "Is there something wrong with the wine? You haven't taken a sip." Seo-Jin finally looked up, and for a split second, the coldness of the Mafia boss vanished, replaced by a raw, naked longing. "The wine doesn't matter," he murmured. "I'm just making sure you're still here." Zaria stiffened, her eyes narrowing. "I'm not a ghost, Mr. Kang, and I'm not a decoration. If you're not going to eat, you're taking up space for someone who will." A ghost of a smile touched Seo-Jin's lips, the first flicker of genuine amusement he'd felt in years. She was prickly, fierce, and entirely unimpressed by his shadow. She was nothing like the woman he lost, yet she was the only thing that made the world feel real again. "Then bring me the menu," he said softly. "I'm staying." The lunch rush had subsided, leaving the restaurant in a state of mid-afternoon exhaustion, but the air around the back booth remained charged. Zaria disappeared into the kitchen, her mind racing. She didn't just want to feed Seo-Jin, she wanted to challenge him. If he was looking for a ghost, she would show him someone undeniably alive. She pushed aside the standard menu and reached for her personal stash of ingredients, spices that didn't belong in a greasy spoon diner. She began to cook a West African Korean fusion dish, a recipe she had been tinkering with in the late hours of the night. It was a bold, spicy jollof-inspired rice topped with perfectly seared, sesame-glazed short ribs. When she returned to the booth, the aroma preceded her. It was sharp, savory, and deeply nostalgic. Seo-Jin had been staring out the window, but as the plate touched the table, his posture shattered. The steam hit his face, carrying the scent of fermented chili and charred ginger, the exact olfactory profile of his late wife's signature comfort food. For a second, his eyes glazed over, and he wasn't in a diner in Scottsdale. He was back in a small kitchen in Seoul, watching a woman laugh as she wiped flour from her forehead. "Eat," Zaria said, her voice softer than before, though her chin remained high. Seo-Jin picked up the fork with a hand that visibly trembled. He took a single bite. The heat of the Scotch bonnet pepper hit first, followed by the deep, earthy sweetness of the soy and pear marinade. It wasn't an exact replica of his wife's cooking. It was brighter, more aggressive, and entirely new. He closed his eyes, a single sharp intake of breath escaping his lungs. "How?" he whispered. "My own recipe," Zaria replied, crossing her arms. "My sister says it's too much, that people around here want bland, but I don't do bland." Seo-Jin looked up at her, and the distance between them seemed to collapse. He didn't see the resemblance anymore. He saw the soul behind the craft. The grief that had felt like a solid lead weight in his chest for months began to crack, letting in a sliver of light that was almost painful. "It's not too much," he said, his voice thick. "It's the first thing I've truly tasted in 2 years." He looked at Zaria, not at her heart-shaped face or her expressive eyes, but at the flour smudge on her cheek and the fire in her gaze. He realized then that he wasn't just coming here to remember someone he lost. He was coming here because for the first time since the funeral, he wanted to be found. Zaria felt a flush creep up her neck. She had meant to prove her independence, but in the silence that followed, she realized she had accidentally offered him a tether. "Good," she said, turning away before he could see her expression soften. "Then finish it. I have tables to bus." As she walked away, Seo-Jin didn't let her out of his sight. He watched the way she moved, not like a ghost, but like a storm. And for the first time, he found himself wondering if he was strong enough to survive it. Sung-Ho Park didn't like the way the Scottsdale air felt lately. It was too soft, too quiet, and far too focused on a woman who didn't know how to keep her head down. From his vantage point across the street, tucked into the shadow of a nondescript sedan, Sung-Ho watched Zaria exit the restaurant. She walked with a tired, rhythmic grace, her braids swaying against her shoulders as she checked her phone. She was unaware of the 2 men trailing her from the alleyway, thugs from Victor Yun's peripheral crew, looking for a way to prove their worth. They were young, sloppy, and dangerous. Sung-Ho adjusted his earpiece. "The targets are moving. Permission to engage." "Minimize the noise," Seo-Jin's voice crackled back, cold and devoid of the warmth he showed in the back booth. "She must not see you. She must not know." Sung-Ho stepped out of the car. He didn't run, he glided. As Zaria turned the corner toward her apartment, the 2 men accelerated, their hands reaching for the pockets of their oversized hoodies. They never made it to the sidewalk. Sung-Ho intercepted them in the mouth of the alley. It was a clinical, silent erasure. A strike to the throat, a sweep of the legs, and the sound of 2 bodies hitting the damp pavement. By the time Zaria reached her front door, fumbling for her keys, the alley was empty. The threat had been neutralized before she even sensed it. Over the next few days, Zaria's world became inexplicably easier. The aggressive landlord who had been threatening her with eviction for a week-old repair issue suddenly called to apologize, promising a new stove by Friday. The broken street lamp outside her bedroom window, which had been dark for months, flickered to life. Even the neighborhood's usual tension seemed to evaporate whenever she walked down the street. "Is it just me?" Lena asked one evening, peering through the blinds of their small living room. "Or is it weirdly peaceful out there? I haven't seen a single shady character on this block in 3 days." Zaria paused, her hand gripping a stack of culinary textbooks. She felt the prickle of unease at the back of her neck, the same feeling she had when Seo-Jin watched her at the restaurant. It was a suffocating kind of safety. "It's too quiet," Zaria murmured. She thought of Seo-Jin's piercing eyes and the way he had looked at her after tasting her food. He had promised to look at the future, but it felt like he was building a fortress around her without her permission. Her pride, usually a shield, now felt like a target. She didn't want to be a princess in a tower guarded by a dragon she barely understood. She wanted to be free, but as she looked out at the perfectly lit street, she realized the shadow of the dragon was already everywhere. The sense of unease that had been prickling at Zaria's neck for days finally solidified into a cold, hard truth on Friday morning. She was standing in her kitchen, staring at a brand-new industrial-grade stove that had been installed while she was at her double shift. Beside it on the counter sat a thick, cream-colored envelope with her name written in precise, elegant calligraphy. Inside wasn't a bill or an eviction notice. It was a new lease agreement. Zaria read the document 3 times, her eyes widening with every line. The building had been sold to a private holding company, and her rent, previously a source of constant, late-night anxiety, had been slashed by 70%. Attached to the back was a letter from a community trust, informing her that her remaining balance for the year had been prepaid in full. "Zaria, look at this," Lena called out from the living room, holding a letter of her own. "The Culinary Institute just emailed. They said an anonymous donor set up a scholarship specifically for local talent with industry experience. It covers the full tuition and the equipment fees. Zaria, this is it. This is your dream." Lena was beaming, already dancing around the small space, but Zaria felt like the walls were closing in. This wasn't a dream, it was a script, and someone else was writing her lines. That afternoon, she didn't go to her shift early. Instead, she walked straight to the back booth where Seo-Jin was already waiting, his presence as steady and immovable as a mountain. He looked up as she approached, his gaze soft, but Zaria slammed the cream-colored envelope onto the table between them. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice low and vibrating with suppressed fury. Seo-Jin didn't flinch. He glanced at the envelope, then back at her. "It is security, Zaria. It is a way to ensure that your talent isn't wasted on worrying about repairs or rent." "I didn't ask for your security," Zaria snapped, leaning over the table, her heart-shaped face tight with indignation. "I've spent my whole life earning every cent I have. I am not a charity case, and I am certainly not your late wife's ghost to be kept in a gilded cage." "I am not treating you as a ghost," Seo-Jin said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, protective register. "I am treating you as someone who is being watched by people far more dangerous than me. If you are in my sight, you are safe. If you are not, you are a target." "Then let me be a target," Zaria countered, her defensive independence flaring. "At least then I'd be a free woman. You think you're protecting me, but you're just replacing one kind of fear with another. I won't sign it. I won't take the money." Seo-Jin stood up, his height suddenly overwhelming the small booth. He looked down at her, a flicker of pain crossing his intense features. "You would risk everything just to prove you don't need me." "I don't need you, Seo-Jin," she whispered, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed. "I wanted you. There's a difference." She turned and walked away, leaving the gilded lease on the table. Behind her, Seo-Jin remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides. He had tried to build her a fortress, but all he had succeeded in doing was proving that he was still the man who didn't know how to love something without trying to own it. The golden safety Seo-Jin had meticulously built around the restaurant shattered during a Tuesday evening shift. The air was thick with the scent of fried onions and rain-slicked pavement when the streetlights outside suddenly flickered and died, plunging the block into a localized, unnatural darkness. Zaria was at the counter, her hands steady as she prepped a takeout order, but her internal radar was screaming. The usual hum of the neighborhood, the distant sirens, the chatter of passers-by had gone silent. It was a vacuum, the kind of stillness that precedes a landslide. The door chime rang, but it wasn't the rhythmic, heavy step of Seo-Jin. It was a sharp, aggressive click of leather soles. A man walked in, flanked by 2 others whose shadows seemed to stretch too long across the linoleum. He didn't look like a customer, he looked like a predator entering a cage. He was lean, with slicked-back hair and a smile that didn't reach his cold, narrow eyes. "Victor Yun," Lena whispered from the kitchen doorway, her voice trembling. Victor didn't look at Lena. He walked straight to the counter, leaning over until he was inches from Zaria's face. He reached out, his fingers hovering near the silver earring she had worn to the gala, the night this all began. "So this is the miracle," he murmured, his voice a chilling rasp. "The girl who brought a dead man back to life." Zaria didn't flinch. She felt the cold sweat on her neck, but her heart-shaped face remained a mask of defiance. "The grill is closed. You need to leave." Victor laughed, a dry, rattling sound. He pulled a single white lily from his jacket pocket, the same flower Seo-Jin had described in the funeral rites of his late wife, and laid it on Zaria's silver serving tray. "I wanted to see if the resemblance was real. It is a perfect, fragile copy. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. But copies are so easy to break, aren't they? Before Zaria could respond, a dark sedan screeched to a halt outside. Sung-ho Park burst through the door, his eyes scanning the room with lethal intent. Victor didn't panic. He simply straightened his luxury suit and stepped back, holding up his hands in a mocking gesture of peace. "Tell your boss his sight is failing," Victor said to Sung-ho, though his eyes remained locked on Zaria. "You can't watch a ghost forever." As Victor and his men retreated into the night, the weight of the moment hit Zaria. The gilded lease and the anonymous scholarships weren't just about control. They were about a war she had been drafted into without her consent. She looked at the white lily on her tray, its petals stark and ghostly against the silver, and realized that Seo-Jin's protection had done the one thing she feared most. It had made her a target. The door chime rang again, and this time it was Seo-Jin. He looked at the flower, then at Zaria's pale face, and the raw, cold fury that crossed his features was more terrifying than Victor's smile. The silence following Victor's exit was heavier than the darkness that had preceded it. Seo-Jin stood by the counter, his eyes fixed on the white lily as if it were a poisonous viper. He reached out to snatch the flower away, but Zaria's hand shot out, pinning the stem to the tray. "Don't touch it," she said, her voice like cold flint. Seo-Jin looked up, his expression a turbulent mix of regret and burgeoning violence. "Zaria, you don't understand. He is a man who builds his life on the wreckage of others. I should never have let him get this close." "You shouldn't have let him get close," Zaria laughed. But there was no humor in it, only the sharp edge of a woman who had finally found the thread and was ready to pull. "He's only here because of you, Seo-Jin. He's only looking at me because you've spent weeks acting like I'm the center of your universe. You didn't protect me. You pinned a target to my chest and called it safety." "I was trying to keep the past from repeating itself." Seo-Jin's voice rose, a rare crack appearing in his stoic facade. He stepped toward her, his hands open as if trying to catch a falling star. "My wife died because I wasn't watchful enough. I promised myself I would never let someone like you be out of my sight again." Zaria didn't back down. She stepped out from behind the counter, forcing him to face her as an equal. "That's just it, Seo-Jin. You aren't looking at me. You're looking at a memory. You're looking at a mistake you're trying to fix. But I am not a second chance for your conscience. I am Zaria Bennett. I am a woman who works for what she has, and I will not be a pawn in your Mafia war." She reached into her apron and pulled out the set of keys to the new apartment, the keys he had essentially forced upon her. She dropped them into the center of the lily's white petals. "Take your security and your ghosts and get out of my restaurant," she said, her heart-shaped face set in a mask of absolute independence. "If I'm going to be in danger, I'd rather face it on my own feet than in a cage you built. Don't come back, Seo-Jin. Don't watch me. Don't look for me. Just let me be." Seo-Jin looked at the keys, then at the woman standing before him. For the first time, he truly saw her, not the resemblance to his wife, but the fire that made her unique. She was willing to walk into the dark just to prove she belonged to herself. "If I leave," he whispered, his voice thick with a sudden, devastating realization, "he will come for you." "Then let him," Zaria replied, her dark eyes flashing. "At least I'll know I'm the one fighting my own battles. Now go." Seo-Jin lingered for a heartbeat, the instinct to protect warring with the newfound respect for her will. Finally, he bowed his head, took the lily and the keys and walked out into the night. He didn't look back, but as the door chimed behind him, the air in the restaurant felt thin, cold, and terrifyingly free. The following night, the air in Scottsdale didn't just feel thin. It felt heavy with the weight of an ending. Seo-Jin Kang stood in the center of a dimly lit warehouse on the industrial edge of the city, far from the polished marble of the Gala. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was in a simple black tactical shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the subtle tattoos of a life he had tried to bury. Sung-ho stood behind him, a shadow within shadows. "The council is waiting, sir. If you do this, there is no going back. You'll be handing Victor everything you've spent a decade building." "I am not handing him anything," Seo-Jin said, his voice a calm, lethal vibration. "I am buying something. There is a difference." The heavy iron doors groaned open, and Victor Yun stepped into the light, flanked by a dozen men. He looked around the empty warehouse, a smirk playing on his thin lips. A surrender? From the great Kang? I must say I expected more fireworks. This isn't a surrender, Seo-Jin replied, stepping forward until he was inches from Victor's cold gaze. This is a trade. I am liquidating my remaining holdings in the city. Every route, every contact, every cent of the Kang influence is yours. In exchange, I want a blood-signed treaty. Zaria Bennett and her family are to be invisible to you. If a single shadow so much as crosses her path, I will come back, and I won't come back as a businessman. Victor's eyes narrowed. He looked at the paperwork on the table, the keys to an empire Seo-Jin had once ruled with an iron fist. You'd give up a kingdom for a waitress. I'd give up the world for the woman she is, Seo-Jin corrected, his voice dropping to a whisper that made even Victor's men shift uncomfortably. She doesn't want my protection. She doesn't want my money. So I am giving her the only thing she actually asked for, her life back, exactly as it was before I broke the silence. Victor laughed, but it was a hollow sound. He realized then that Seo-Jin wasn't being weak, he was being more dangerous than ever. A man with an empire has something to lose. A man who has given it all away for a single cause has nothing left to fear. The ink was wet when Seo-Jin turned to leave. He didn't look back at the assets he'd signed away. He walked out into the cool night air, feeling the phantom weight of his sight finally lifting. He had cleared the board. He had removed the target. He drove past the restaurant one last time. He didn't stop. He didn't park in the back booth's shadow. Through the window, he saw Zaria laughing with a customer, her heart-shaped face bright under the flickering fluorescent lights. She was working. She was free. She was undeniably, fiercely alive. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, and forced himself to keep driving. He had paid the final debt. Now he had to prove he could survive the silence. 6 months had passed since the night the streetlights went dark in Scottsdale. For Zaria, those months had been a masterclass in quiet restoration. Without the shadow management of a benefactor, she had worked her way through the final modules of her culinary certification, her hands often smelling of garlic and victory. She still worked at the restaurant, but the atmosphere had changed. The air felt open, and the back booth remained empty, a silent monument to a man who had finally learned the meaning of a request. As Zaria finished her final shift before graduation, the desert air was cool, carrying the scent of blooming cactus. She stepped out of the service entrance, her heart-shaped face tilted up to catch the first few stars. A familiar car sat at the curb. It wasn't the armored beast that used to follow her, but a simple, elegant sedan. Standing beside it was Seo-Jin. He looked different. The rigid, lethal edge of his posture had softened into something more human. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a tactical shirt. He wore a casual linen jacket, looking like a man who had finally put down a heavy burden. Zaria stopped, her defensive independence flaring for only a second before she saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't the look of a man seeing a ghost. It was the look of a man seeing a future. "You're late," he said softly, echoing their first meeting in the diner. Zaria smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that reached her eyes. "I don't keep a schedule for people who aren't on the menu, Seo-Jin." He walked toward her, stopping just outside her personal space, respecting the boundary she had drawn in the sand months ago. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 one-way tickets. They weren't for a safe house or a corporate retreat. They were for Europe. "I've spent these months making sure the past can never find you," he whispered. "I've cleared the debts and closed the doors, but I realize that staying here is just another way of looking back. There is a small coastal town where nobody knows my name, and they've never heard of a Gala. I'm going there to start over, not as a boss, just as a man." He held out the tickets, his hand steady. "I'm not offering you a cage, Zaria. I'm offering you a partner. If you want to stay here and build your own kitchen, I will leave and never look back. But if you want to see what the future looks like without a target on your chest, come with me." Under the light of the Arizona stars, Seo-Jin dropped to one knee. He didn't present a ring of power or status, but a simple band of gold. "I promised I would never let you out of my sight. I finally understand that it means witnessing your life, not controlling it. Will you go to Europe with me?" Zaria looked at the man who had given up a kingdom just to give her a choice. She reached out, her fingers brushing his cheek, not as a ghost, but as a woman who had finally found someone worth the collision. "I'm not finished with my menu yet," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I think I can finish it in Europe." Seo-Jin stood, a look of profound release washing over his features. As they walked toward the car, the silence of the night was no longer heavy. It was a blank page. The city glittered behind them, a world of old ghosts and broken glass, as they drove toward a bright European morning where they would finally, for the first time, look forward together.